Chapter 1: The Wrong Kind of Echo. The air in the old Gable house hung thick, a cocktail of dust, decay, and something else, a faint underlying bitterness that caught in the back of Maddox Greaves' throat. He ran a calloused hand over the splintered newel post at the bottom of the main staircase, the wood powdered and soft under his touch. "She's got bones, all right," Maddox grunted, more to himself than to the younger men trailing behind him. "Rotten ones, mostly." Pip Sorrel, barely out of his apprenticeship, hovered at the edge of the gloomy foyer, his new tool belt looking conspicuously clean. "Smells. Old, mad, real old. Houses like this always do, Greenhorn." Maddox clapped a hand on Pip's shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring but perhaps carrying too much of the day's weariness. "Gives 'em character. Our job is to give this one a new spine." He swept an arm around, indicating the water-stained walls, the peeling wallpaper that drooped like sunburnt skin, the chandelier that hung askew, caked in decades of grime. Full gut down to the studs in most places. New electric, new plumbing, reinforcing that load-bearer in the dining room. Mr. Gable wants it habitable, not just standing. Corvus Blackwood, leaning against a doorframe with his arms crossed, let out a dry chuckle. "Habitable for who, I wonder? Place gives me the creeps." Corvus, with his leathery skin and eyes that had seen more bad wiring than good, was the crew's resident cynic, and increasingly its self-proclaimed paranormal expert. He whittled a small piece of lath with a penknife, shavings falling onto the dusty floorboards. "Pays the bills, Crow," Maddox said, though he understood the sentiment. The Gable house wasn't just neglected, it felt resistant, hostile even. An architect's nightmare from the early 20th century, a mishmash of styles with too many small, dark rooms and narrow corridors. Wynne Gable, the client, had been oddly cagey about the property's history, focusing only on the speed of the renovation. "Needs to be done fast," he'd stressed, his eyes darting around his own newly acquired property as if expecting something to jump out. Jewel Kilby, the electrician, and Val Calder, the plumber, were already making their initial sweeps, their voices echoing from deeper within the structure. Jewel's flashlight beam cut across a far hallway. "Main panel's a relic, Maddox. Looks like Edison himself wired it. Gonna be a full rewire, no question." "Figured as much," Maddox called back. He tugged a folded set of blueprints from his back pocket. "All right, let's walk it again. Demo starts tomorrow. I want containment up on all these archways. Dining room, parlor, kitchen first. Pip, you're on debris duty with Corvus." The first few days of demolition passed in a cloud of plaster dust and the screech of crowbars. The house groaned under the assault, ancient lath complaining, studs revealing the gray, powdery trails of long-dead termites. They filled dumpster after dumpster. Each evening, Maddox and his crew locked up, the silence descending on the ravaged interior, a silence that felt heavier than it should. On the third morning, Pip was the first to arrive, tasked with setting up the coffee maker and unlocking. He pushed open the heavy front door and stopped. The plastic sheeting they'd meticulously stapled over the dining room archway lay in a crumpled heap on the floor. Several of the larger tools, Maddox's favorite sledgehammer, Val's big pipe wrench, a pry bar, were not where they'd been left in the designated corner of the foyer. Instead, they were arranged in a neat, almost deliberate line across the dining room threshold. Pip frowned. "Mad," he began, as Maddox's truck rumbled to a halt outside. Maddox surveyed the scene, his jaw tightening. "Kids, vandals." "Door was locked same as I left it, boss," Pip said, his voice uncertain. "Window latches are all still painted shut from the inside, remember." Corvus arrived next, taking in the sight with a grim nod. "Told you, House doesn't like us." "House doesn't have opinions, Crow," Maddox snapped, though a sliver of unease pricked at him. He picked up his sledgehammer, its familiar weight a small comfort. "Probably just settled, plastic came loose, and one of us was tired and misremembered where we put things." He pointedly looked from Pip to Corvus. Neither met his gaze directly. They rehung the plastic, thicker this time, with more staples. Work resumed. Yet the incident left a subtle pall. Tools seemed to go missing more frequently, only to turn up in odd places. A hammer left on a windowsill found on the mantelpiece. A box of nails carefully placed on a sawhorse discovered under a pile of rubble in another room. Maddox started triple-checking the locks each night, his own routine becoming more rigid, as if order could ward off whatever this was. The sound started soon after, faint at first, a floorboard creaking upstairs when everyone was on the ground floor, a soft thud from an empty room. Maddox, a man who prided himself on his practicality, blamed the old structure settling, the wind, the city noises filtering through. "You hear that?" Pip asked one afternoon, pausing with a loaded debris bucket. They were clearing out the master bedroom, a vast, shadowy space with a deep fireplace. Maddox straightened from prying loose a section of rotted window frame. "Hear what?" "The traffic on Elm Street." "No," sounded like someone dragging something heavy over in the next room. Pip gestured with his head towards the adjoining dressing room, its door askew. Maddox listened. The house was quiet save for the distant drone of Jules saw cutting through old studs downstairs. Nothing, greenhorn, nerves. But later that day, Val swore he heard water running in the upstairs bathroom, the one whose pipes had been disconnected and drained 2 days prior. He'd gone up to check, tools in hand, and found only dry, corroded fittings and an echoing silence. Jewel complained of cold spots that moved, sudden pockets of icy air in rooms that were otherwise stuffy and warm. He'd started wearing an extra thermal layer under his work shirt. One evening, Maddox was the last to leave. He did a final walk-through, flashlight beam dancing across exposed lath and piles of debris. He made sure every portable tool was gathered, every temporary light switched off. He locked the sturdy new padlock on the front door, then added a hasp and a second padlock he'd bought that afternoon, feeling vaguely foolish. As he walked to his truck, he glanced back. For a moment in the dim upstairs window of the master bedroom, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows. He blinked. It was gone. Too tired, he told himself. Too much dust in my eyes. The following Monday, they began framing the new walls in the dining room. By the end of the day, a significant section of the north wall was studded out, plumb and square. Maddox felt a surge of satisfaction looking at the fresh, pale wood against the dark chaos of the old house. Progress. Tangible change. The next morning, the entire newly framed section was gone. Not collapsed, not simply fallen over. The studs, the plates, the carefully driven nails vanished. The space where it had stood was empty, save for a neat pile of unused lumber stacked where their new wall had been. The nails were gone. Not a single one littered the floor. Maddox stared, his coffee forgotten in his hand. Pip stood beside him, pale. Corvus, who had walked in just behind them, let out a low whistle. "Well now," Corvus said, his voice lacking its usual cynical edge, replaced by something akin to awe. "That ain't settling, and that ain't kids." Jewel and Val joined them, their expressions mirroring Maddox's disbelief. "This is impossible," Jewel muttered, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "The materials, where did they go? Those were 16-foot studs. Someone would need a truck." "Door was locked, both locks. Hasp untouched," Maddox stated, his voice flat. He had checked them himself upon arrival. He walked into the dining room, his boots crunching softly on the debris. He ran his hand along the chalk line on the floor where the bottom plate had been. Clean, as if it had never been there. He looked at the pile of fresh lumber. It was their lumber, the same grade, the same supplier tags, but it was stacked too neatly, too perfectly, as if delivered that morning. And the nails. The missing nails were the most disturbing part. Not dropped, not scattered. Gone. "The house. It doesn't want to be changed," Pip whispered, his eyes wide. "Don't be an idiot," Maddox said, but his voice lacked conviction. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't misremembered tools or loose plastic. This was an act of impossible deconstruction. He looked around the shadowed room at the gaping holes where windows had been, at the dark maw of the fireplace. The wrong kind of echo wasn't just sound anymore. It was action. Their work undone. A perfect, silent, mocking reversal. He took a deep breath, the bitter air filling his lungs. "All right," Maddox announced, forcing a firmness he didn't feel into his tone. "We build it again, and this time someone stays and watches." He ignored the uneasy exchange of glances between his men. He wouldn't be beaten by an old, empty house. He couldn't afford to be. But as he picked up his hammer, the weight of it felt different, less a tool of construction and more a flimsy weapon against an unseen, unknown adversary. The day stretched before them, filled with the promise of hard work, and now a creeping, undeniable dread. The silence of the Gable House seemed to press in, waiting. Chapter 2: The Glazier's Distortions. The decision that someone would stay and watch was met with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. Corvus, surprisingly, volunteered, citing his insomnia and a morbid curiosity. Maddox, though reluctant to leave one man alone, agreed. He supplied Corvus with a powerful flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and his own cell number on speed dial. "Anything. Anything at all you call," Maddox had instructed, clapping the older carpenter on the shoulder. Corvus had just grunted, his eyes already scanning the deepening shadows of the dining room as the rest of the crew packed up. The next morning, Corvus was waiting on the porch steps, looking more haggard than usual. The newly framed wall stood untouched. "Anything?" Maddox asked, trying to keep the apprehension out of his voice. Corvus shook his head, taking a long drag from a hand-rolled cigarette. "Quiet as a tomb, too quiet if you ask me. Nothing moved, nothing creaked, felt like it knew I was watching." He exhaled a plume of smoke. "But that wall's still there, ain't it? A small victory, perhaps, or a temporary reprieve. Maddox didn't know which felt worse. They pressed on. The dining room framing was completed, then the parlor. Jewel began the laborious process of pulling new wires, his drill whining through ancient joists. Val wrestled with new copper pipes, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a counterpoint to Jewel's efforts. Pip, under Maddox's direct supervision, started fitting insulation bats between the new studs. The work was physically demanding, a welcome distraction from the unsettling atmosphere that clung to the Gable house like cobwebs. Glaze Finch arrived a week into the new framing. He was a man of few words, his movements precise and economical as he unloaded panes of new, double-glazed glass from his van. His specialty was custom window fitting, and the Gable house, with its odd-sized openings and warped frames, was a prime candidate for his skills. Maddox walked Glaze through the rooms, pointing out which windows needed immediate attention. "These old sashes are shot. We're going for fixed panes in most of these, keep the heat in. Clients not bothered about opening them." Glaze nodded, making small, neat notes on a pad. He had a habit of looking not at things, but through them, his gaze lingering on a space as if seeing more than was there. When he reached the large bay window in the parlor, he paused. The crew had already removed the rotten sashes, leaving a gaping maw boarded over with plywood. "This one, strong energy here," Glaze murmured, almost to himself, his fingers tracing the edge of the rough opening. Maddox raised an eyebrow. "Energy. It's a hole in the wall. Glaze needs glass." Glaze offered a faint, knowing smile but said nothing more. The first few windows went in smoothly. Glaze worked with a quiet efficiency that Maddox appreciated. The new glass, clean and clear, made a surprising difference, letting in more light, making the rooms feel slightly less oppressive. Slightly. It was Pip who first noticed something amiss with the new windows. He was sweeping up wood shavings in the parlor, late one afternoon. Maddox and the others were out back, discussing a drainage issue. Glaze had finished the bay window and was packing up his tools. Pip glanced at the newly installed central pane. The late afternoon sun slanted through it, casting long shadows. For a split second, the reflection wasn't of the debris-strewn parlor and himself. It was of a room that was subtly different. The furniture, shrouded in what looked like white dust cloths, was arranged differently. And standing in the middle of that reflected, ghostly room was a figure, tall, slender, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing. It was Glaze. It wasn't anyone he knew. Pip blinked, his heart lurching. The reflection snapped back to normal, the empty parlor, his own startled face. He backed away, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Mad!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. Maddox and the others came running. "What is it, Greenhorn? You see a rat." Pip pointed a trembling finger at the window. The reflection, it changed. There was someone, something, in the glass. Maddox frowned, stepping up to the window. He saw his own tired face, Corvus peering over his shoulder, the familiar mess of the parlor behind them. "What are you talking about, Pip? Dust motes getting to you." "No, I swear. It was another room, another person," Pip insisted, his voice rising with a hysterical edge. Glaze, who had paused by the doorway, looked at the window with an unreadable expression. "Glass can play tricks on the eyes," he said softly, "especially old houses. Light gets trapped. Trapped light doesn't look like a bloody funeral director from 100 years ago." Pip shot back, then flushed as Maddox gave him a sharp look. "Calm down, son," Maddox said, though Pip's genuine fear was unsettling. He looked at Glaze. "You see anything unusual when you were fitting these?" Glaze met his gaze. "Windows show what's there, Mr. Greaves, and sometimes what's alongside." He offered no further explanation, turning to collect the last of his sealant guns. The incident was dismissed, attributed to an overactive imagination and fatigue. But a seed of doubt had been planted. Maddox found himself giving the new windows wary glances. Corvus started making pointed comments about spirit photography without the camera. A few days later, Glaze was working on the upstairs windows in what was to be the master bedroom. Maddox was downstairs, conferring with Jewel over a wiring schematic. Pip was assisting Glaze, carefully handing him tools and cleaning up shards of old, brittle glass. "This frame's badly warped," Glaze observed, running a gloved hand along the inside of the sill. "Gonna need some serious shimming." He carefully lifted a large, new pane into place, his movements fluid and practiced. He began applying sealant. Pip, gathering a pile of rotten wood, glanced up at the newly installed glass and froze. Reflected in the pristine surface wasn't the interior of the master bedroom. Instead, he saw what looked like a distorted, darker version of the same room. The walls were a sickly, peeling green. A heavy, ornate bed, draped in cobweb-thick lace, dominated the space. But it was the activity in the reflection that made Pip's breath catch. He saw Glaze, or a figure identical to Glaze, meticulously bricking up the window from the inside of that other room. The reflected Glaze worked with a sinister concentration, laying shadowy bricks one by one, his movements mirrored but somehow imbued with a terrible intent. Behind him, in the gloom of the other room, Pip could make out faint, struggling shapes, as if people were trapped within the walls the reflected Glaze was sealing. "Glaze," Pip whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look." Glaze straightened, wiping sealant from his fingers. He followed Pip's horrified gaze to the window. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, usually calm, seemed to darken. He watched the reflection for a long moment, the spectral mason, the struggling shadows. "They don't like the light," Glaze said, his voice a low murmur. "The others." "Others?" Pip stammered. "Who? What are they doing? Why does it look like you?" "There are always two sides to a reflection, boy," Glaze said, turning away from the window. "One you see, one that sees you." He picked up his caulk gun. "This pane is set. Let's move to the next one." Pip couldn't tear his eyes away. The reflected Glaze continued his work methodically, horribly. As Pip watched, one of the shadowy bricks the reflection was laying seemed to become almost translucent, and for a horrifying instant, he saw a pair of wide, terrified eyes staring out from within it, before the spectral mason covered them over. He stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping him. "Maddox, you need to see this." By the time Maddox arrived, breathless from taking the stairs two at a time, the reflection in the master bedroom window showed only the room itself. the piles of construction materials, and the pale faces of Pip and Glaze. "Another ghost, Pip?" Maddox asked, his patience wearing thin. This was costing them time. It wasn't just a ghost, it was Glaze or something that looked like him. He was bricking up the window from the other side. There were people trapped in the walls. Pip's voice cracked. Maddox looked at Glaze, who was calmly cleaning the edges of the newly installed pane with a cloth. "Well, Glaze, you moonlighting as a phantom bricklayer." Glaze gave a slow shake of his head. "Just installing glass, Mr. Greaves, as per the contract." His gaze flickered towards the window. "Sometimes old houses, they have strong memories. The glass just shows them." Maddox felt a surge of frustration. Memories, this was bordering on madness. He was a builder, a practical man. He dealt in wood and nails, concrete and steel, not in whatever this was, but Pip's terror was too real to dismiss entirely. And Glaze was an enigma. The man spoke in riddles, his calm detachment more unnerving than any panic. "Right," Maddox said, trying to regain control. "Pip, you take a break, go down, make some coffee, strong." He looked at the window, then back at Glaze. "These memories, they always this disturbing." Glaze buffed a smudge from the glass. "The house shares what it wants to share, or what the other house wants to share." "Other house?" Maddox frowned. "What other house?" Glaze gestured vaguely with his cloth. "Every house has its echo, its twin, especially a house like this with history." He paused, then added so quietly Maddox almost missed it. "Some echoes are louder than others. Some are hungry." Before Maddox could press him further, Val yelled from downstairs. "Maddox, get down here. You are not gonna believe this." Maddox cast one last, uneasy look at the impassive window, then at Glaze's unreadable face. He turned and hurried downstairs, Pip close on his heels. The image of the spectral bricklayer burned into the boy's mind. The chill in the Gable House seemed to deepen with every new pane of glass Glaze installed, each one a potential portal to sights no sane mind should witness. The reflections were no longer passive. They were becoming performances, dark plays hinting at a terrifying, connected reality just beyond the pristine surfaces. Chapter 3: The Shifting Chalk Lines. Val Calder stood in the middle of the kitchen, his broad face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. He pointed a trembling finger towards the newly installed copper pipes running along the exposed wall where the old sink had been. "Look at it, Mad. Just look." Maddox's gaze followed Val's finger. The gleaming copper pipes, so neatly soldered and clipped into place just that morning, were now different, not broken, not leaking. But several sections were subtly, impossibly bent into new configurations. A right-angle joint now had a slight, almost organic curve. A straight run of pipe now had a distinct, shallow bend. It was as if the metal itself had softened and warped, then re-hardened. "What in the—" Maddox stepped closer, running his hand along a section. It was solid, cold copper. No signs of tampering, no fresh solder marks. "Did you do this, Val? Trying out some new artistic plumbing?" Val looked offended. "You think I'd waste my time making pipes look like bloody snakes, Maddox? I left for maybe half an hour to fetch the P-traps from the van. Came back to this." Corvus, who had followed them into the kitchen, peered at the pipes, his head cocked. "That ain't natural. Copper doesn't just go for a wiggle on its own." Jewel joined the small crowd, his flashlight beam playing over the deformed plumbing. "Material fatigue. Stress points," he offered, though he sounded unconvinced. "This isn't fatigue, Sparky," Val said, his voice tight. "This is something else. It's like they were reshaped from the inside out." He tapped a bent section. It rang with a dull thud, not the clear note it should have. "Feels clogged, dense." Maddox felt that familiar cold knot in his stomach tighten again. First the deconstructed wall, then the phantom reflections, now animate plumbing. The Gable House wasn't just resisting, it was actively, subtly, corrupting their work. Each trade seemed to face its own unique brand of sabotage. "All right," Maddox said, his voice carefully neutral. "Cut it out, Val. We'll replace these sections, and we'll keep a closer eye on things." He avoided looking at Pip, who was staring at the pipes with wide, horrified eyes, clearly connecting this new strangeness with the bricklayer in the window. The rest of the day was tense. Every creak of the old house, every unexpected shadow, set nerves on edge. Val, muttering curses under his breath, dismantled the warped pipework. When he cut into one of the bent sections, a thick, dark, oily sludge oozed out, smelling faintly of stagnant water and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. It wasn't water from the mains. The supply to the house was still shut off at the street. "What is that stuff?" Pip asked, recoiling from the smell. Val poked at it with the end of his wrench. "Never seen anything like it. Looks like the house's arteries are full of filth." He quickly bagged the section of pipe and its contents, his usual jovial demeanor gone. That evening, Maddox found himself unable to simply leave. The image of those pipes, the sludge, Glaze's cryptic pronouncements about an other house, all swirled in his mind. He told the crew he had some paperwork to catch up on. After they left, he walked through the silent, shadowy rooms, his heavy boots echoing in the emptiness. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Evidence, an explanation, or just a way to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. He ended up in the parlor where Glaze had installed the large bay window. The streetlights outside cast a pale, watery glow into the room. He approached the window cautiously, half expecting to see some spectral drama play out in its depths. The reflection was normal, the dark room, his own silhouette. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned his attention to the floor. Earlier, he'd snapped new chalk lines for a non-load-bearing partition wall they planned to erect the next day. The bright blue lines stood out starkly against the dusty floorboards. He checked them with his tape measure. Perfect. Maddox lingered, an uncharacteristic restlessness keeping him there. He found an old, overturned bucket, wiped it clean with a rag and sat down, facing the bay window, his back to the chalk lines. He just watched the play of shadows, listened to the old house breathe around him. He must have dozed off because he jerked awake sometime later, unsure what had disturbed him. The room was colder, the silence more profound. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. He glanced at the floor, and his blood ran cold. The chalk lines were still there, but they had moved. Not erased and redrawn, moved. The straight, crisp blue lines now had subtle, impossible curves in them. One line, meant to be perfectly parallel to the fireplace, now bowed inwards as if a giant, invisible hand had pushed it. Another, which should have intersected a perpendicular line at a clean 90-degree angle, now veered off to meet it in a grotesque, almost organic junction. The geometry of the planned room was distorted, warped, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Maddox dropped to his knees, his flashlight beam trembling. He touched one of the altered lines. The chalk was undisturbed, still a fine powder on the wood. It was as if the floorboards themselves had shifted beneath the chalk, carrying the lines with them. But the floorboards were solid, ancient oak, nailed firmly to the joists. He scrambled back, a strangled noise escaping his throat. He looked around wildly. Was someone in the house, playing some elaborate, terrifying prank? But the doors were locked, the windows secured. He was alone, or supposed to be. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was beyond tools moving or reflections. This was the house itself, its very fabric, seemingly alive and malevolent. It was actively reshaping their plans, mocking their attempts to impose order. He thought of Glaze's words, "The house shares what it wants to share, or what the other house wants to share." What if the other house had a different floor plan? What if its geometry was bleeding through, imposing itself on their reality? Maddox didn't wait any longer. He grabbed his keys, his tool bag, and practically fled the Gable house, not bothering with the extra hasp and padlock. He drove away too fast, the image of those warped chalk lines burning in his mind. He didn't sleep that night. How could he explain this to his crew? How could he continue to work in a place that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and reason? The next morning, he was the first to arrive, driven by a morbid need to see the lines in the daylight. He half expected them to have reverted to normal, for it all to have been a waking nightmare. They hadn't. The chalk lines were exactly as he'd seen them, bent, distorted, a mockery of his careful measurements. Pip was the first of the crew to see them. He stopped dead in the parlor doorway, his face draining of color. Mad, the lines. Maddox just nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, I see them." Corvus, Jewel, and Val soon joined them, their reactions ranging from stunned silence to profane disbelief. This ain't possible," Jewel stammered, crouching down to examine a curved line. "Chalk doesn't just bend." "Maybe the floor shifted," Val offered weakly. "An earth tremor we didn't feel." Corvus shook his head. "Nails are still seated. Joists underneath are solid. I checked M last week. This house, it's playing with us." He looked directly at Maddox. "What are we gonna do, boss? We can't build on lines that look like a damn drunken spider drew M." Maddox felt the weight of their gazes. He was the foreman, the one supposed to have the answers. But he had none. Only a growing, sickening dread. He thought of when Gable, their cagey client, so desperate for the renovation to be completed quickly. What did Gable know about this house? What horrors was he trying to pave over with new plaster and fresh paint? We snap new lines," Maddox said, his voice hoarse. "We ignore these. We build what we're supposed to build." It sounded feeble, even to his own ears. How do you fight something that can rewrite your plans on the very floorboards beneath your feet? As Pip reluctantly retrieved the chalk line reel, Maddox noticed Glaze Finch standing quietly in the doorway, his tool bag at his feet. He'd arrived unnoticed amidst the commotion. The glazier surveyed the distorted lines, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze lifted, moving around the room as if he were seeing not the physical space, but the energy within it. The geometry is unstable, Glaze observed, his voice calm amidst their agitation. The other place, it's pressing through. It has different intentions for this space. Different intentions, Maddox almost shouted. What does that mean? Is it going to start moving walls next, swallowing rooms whole? Glaze looked at Maddox, a hint of something that might have been pity in his eyes. It might, or it might want different occupants. He glanced briefly at the crew, then back to the warped lines on the floor. You're trying to impose your order on a place that answers to an older, stronger design. A design from elsewhere. Before Maddox could demand a clearer answer, a new sound cut through the tense atmosphere. A faint, rhythmic scraping coming from upstairs. It was a sound they all recognized. The sound of a tool being used. A saw, perhaps, or a rasp. But they were all downstairs, every single one of them. The scraping stopped. Then a single, distinct thump echoed from the floor above, directly over their heads, as if something heavy had been dropped, or set down with purpose. No one spoke. They just looked upwards at the stained ceiling, a collective fear holding them captive. The shifting chalk lines were one thing. Active, unseen work happening above them was another entirely. The house wasn't just resisting. It was building something of its own. Chapter 4: The Unseen Scaffolding. The rhythmic scraping, followed by that definitive thump from upstairs, hung in the air of the parlor like a physical weight. Every eye was fixed on the ceiling. Corvus slowly reached into his belt and pulled out his hammer. Its scarred wooden handle a familiar comfort in his grip. Val did likewise with a heavy wrench. Even Jewel, normally the least physically imposing, picked up a length of discarded conduit, holding it like a club. Nobody's supposed to be up there, Maddox stated, his voice a low growl. He looked at his crew, their faces pale but set. Pip, you stay here with Glaze, the rest of you with me. Quietly. Glaze Finch, however, showed no inclination to stay put. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the staircase leading up from the foyer. The connections are strengthening, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The veil thins. Maddox, too on edge to question the glazier's cryptic pronouncements, just grunted and led the way. He took the stairs slowly, testing each tread before putting his full weight on it. The old wood groaned softly, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the charged silence. Corvus was right behind him, then Val, then Jewel, a reluctant caboose. They reached the upstairs landing. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a grimy window at the end of the hall. The doors to the various bedrooms stood open, dark rectangles promising nothing good. The scraping sound did not resume. The silence felt predatory. "Which room?" Val whispered, his knuckles white on the wrench. Maddox listened intently. The thump had sounded like it came from the large front bedroom, the one designated as the future master suite, where Pip had seen the spectral bricklayer in the window's reflection. He pointed towards it. They approached the doorway cautiously, peering in. The room was as they'd left it, piles of debris, exposed lath, the newly installed window gleaming faintly. Nothing seemed out of place. No tools lay about that weren't their own. No sign of any intruder. "Hello," Maddox called out, his voice unnaturally loud. "Anyone here?" Only the echo answered, swallowed by the dusty emptiness. Jewel shivered despite the stuffy air. Maybe it was, I don't know, a loose board, animals. "That was no squirrel, Sparky," Corvus said, his eyes scanning the ceiling of the room. "That was deliberate." Maddox stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping every corner. He ran his hand along a newly framed section of wall they'd put up yesterday. Solid. Intact. He looked at the window where glaze had installed the pane. The reflection was normal, showing only the room and their tense faces. Then Pip's voice, tight with alarm, called from downstairs. "Maddox, Glaze says you need to see this. In the parlor." With a shared look of frustration and unease, Maddox and the others descended the stairs again. They found Pip standing in the middle of the parlor, staring not at the floor, but at the space just above where the new partition wall was supposed to be built. Glaze stood beside him, his expression, as usual, unreadable. "What is it now?" Maddox demanded, his patience frayed. Glaze raised a hand, pointing towards the empty air about 7 feet off the ground, directly above the now-curved chalk lines. "There," he said. "Can you not perceive it?" Maddox stared. He saw nothing but air dust motes the opposite wall. Perceive what, Glaze? Another bloody memory. "Not a memory, a construct," Glaze replied, his voice even. "From the other place. They are building alongside you, or perhaps ahead of you." Pip swallowed hard. I bumped into it, mad, swear to God, walked right into something solid, like a plank, but there's nothing there." He rubbed his shoulder. Corvus snorted. "Kids seeing things that ain't there now." "Am not," Pip insisted. "It was real, cold too." Glaze stepped forward. He reached up, his hand moving slowly as if approaching a timid animal. About head height for Maddox, Glaze's fingers stopped, pressing against nothing. Yet his hand flexed as if encountering resistance. He pushed gently. An expression of faint surprise touched his features. "It's denser than I anticipated. They are making progress." Maddox watched, bewildered. Glaze was either an incredibly convincing actor or he was genuinely interacting with something unseen. He stepped forward, cautiously reaching out to the same spot. His hand passed through empty air. He waved it around. Nothing. "I don't get it, Glaze," Maddox said, frustration mounting. "What are you feeling?" "Scaffolding," Glaze said simply. "Or the equivalent, theirs. It interpenetrates. It occupies the same space but in a different phase." He tilted his head. "Listen." Maddox strained his ears. He heard the distant city hum, the creak of the house, Pip's ragged breathing. Then something else, faint, very faint. A slight, almost subaudible scraping sound, but it wasn't coming from upstairs this time. It seemed to be emanating from the empty air right in front of him, where Glaze's hand had met resistance. It was accompanied by a barely perceptible vibration, a coolness that hadn't been there moments before. Val and Jewel, looking skeptical, also reached out. Val's hand, like Maddox, found nothing. But Jewel, his face etched with concentration, suddenly gasped, snatching his hand back. "Cold," Jewel exclaimed. Felt it like touching ice, and it pushed back a little. His eyes were wide. Corvus, ever the cynic but now looking deeply unsettled, slowly extended a calloused finger. He prodded the air. His eyes narrowed. He pushed harder, his finger visibly bent against an unseen barrier. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed, pulling his hand back slowly. "It's there, solid as, well, not oak, but it's bloody there." Maddox felt a wave of disorientation. 3 of them had now felt it. He tried again, concentrating, reaching out slowly. This time his fingertips brushed against something. It was an almost imperceptible resistance, a subtle pressure and an intense, localized coldness like a sheet of frozen air. He pushed, and his fingers met a smooth, unyielding surface. He could feel its outline, a long, horizontal plane like a plank. He ran his hand along it. It extended several feet. What is it made of?" Maddox whispered, his voice hoarse. "Difficult to say," Glaze mused. "The substance of their reality. It manifests here as a thermal and tactile anomaly. They are likely unaware of your direct interaction, just as you are mostly unaware of theirs. But the spaces are bleeding together more now." The implications were staggering. An unseen construction crew from another dimension, another reality, was working in the same space, their structures occupying the Gable House like ghostly overlays, sometimes becoming solid enough to touch. The deconstructed wall, the warped pipes, the shifting chalk lines. It wasn't just random paranormal activity. It was a direct consequence of 2 realities clashing, 2 sets of blueprints vying for the same physical location. "So the scraping sound from upstairs," Val began. "Likely them working on their upper level," Glaze finished. "Their sounds, their actions, bleed through, just as your hammering and sawing must be a strange, percussive symphony to them." "And the thump?" Maddox asked, remembering the definitive sound that had drawn them upstairs. Glaze was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. Perhaps they dropped one of their tools, or set down a heavy component for their structure. He looked at the space where the invisible plank was. "They are building something, something substantial." The idea of an unseen, parallel construction project was both ludicrous and terrifying. It explained so much, yet opened up a Pandora's box of new fears. Who were these others? What were they building? And what would happen when their constructions and the crew's renovations tried to occupy the exact same point in space? Jewel, looking pale, backed away from the invisible scaffolding. I don't like this, Maddox. This is way above my pay grade. Wiring a house is one thing. Wiring a house that's cohabiting with ghosts with tool belts. No thanks." "They are not ghosts, not precisely," Glaze corrected gently. "They are as real in their dimension as you are in yours. The house is the bridge, a weak point between worlds." Corvus ran a hand over his face. "So, every time I drive a nail, I might be nailing it into some invisible spirit's backside." "Unlikely to be so direct," Glaze said, "but you might be obstructing their work, or they yours. The deconstruction of your wall was likely them clearing a space they perceived as an obstruction." Maddox felt a headache beginning to throb behind his temples. This was too much. He was a builder, a man of plumb lines and spirit levels. How was he supposed to operate in a world of interpenetrating realities and invisible scaffolding? "So what do we do?" Val asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "Do we? I don't know. Try to coordinate with them. Leave them notes," he laughed, a short, nervous bark. "Communication may be problematic," Glaze said, with considerable understatement. "Their perceptions, their motivations, are likely as alien to you as yours are to them." "Mr. Gable," Maddox said suddenly. "Gable has to know something about this. He was so insistent on speed, so shifty about the house's history." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling him. He needs to explain what kind of madhouse he's bought." As Maddox scrolled for Gable's number, a new sound began. It was faint, coming from all around them, yet also seeming to originate from within the walls, the floor, the very air. A soft, rhythmic pulsing like a giant, slow heartbeat. And with it, a subtle tremor ran through the floorboards, not strong enough to shake things, but a distinct, unsettling vibration. The invisible scaffolding plank Pip had first bumped into suddenly flickered, and for a terrifying, stomach-lurching instant, it became partially visible. A translucent, grayish beam, crisscrossed with intricate, unfamiliar symbols that glowed with a faint, internal light. Then, just as quickly, it vanished, becoming intangible again. But they had all seen it. It's getting stronger," Pip whispered, his eyes fixed on the spot. "The other place, it's coming through more." The pulsing continued, a slow, inexorable beat. Maddox's finger hovered over Gable's contact number. The house felt like it was holding its breath, or perhaps taking a new one. The boundaries were blurring, and the unseen architects from the other side were making their presence unmistakably, terrifyingly known. Chapter 5: The Counterartisan's Blueprint. When Gable did not answer his phone, Maddox let it ring, the futile chirping echoing in the tense parlor, each unanswered call ratcheting up his frustration. Finally, it went to voicemail, a curt, pre-recorded message. Maddox snapped the phone shut without leaving a message. "Can't reach him." The slow, rhythmic pulsing continued, a giant, unseen heart beating within the fabric of the Gable house. The tremor underfoot was subtle but persistent. Each beat seemed to make the air feel colder, denser. "So what's the plan, boss?" Corvus asked, his voice rough. He kept glancing at the spot where the translucent beam had flickered into view. "We gonna work around this invisible construction site." Maddox ran a hand through his hair. He felt caught, trapped between his contractual obligation to Gable and the increasingly undeniable, terrifying reality of the house. To abandon the job meant financial penalties, damage to his reputation. To continue meant what? Battling an unseen, unknown entity for every square inch of progress. "We stick to our plans," Maddox said, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We build what we came here to build. If they're in the way—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. How do you demolish something you can barely perceive, something that operates under different laws of physics? Glaze Finch, who had been observing the crew with his usual quiet intensity, spoke. "Their intentions may not be overtly hostile. They may simply be territorial, working towards their own design. a design that does not accommodate yours. And what design is that, Glaze? Maddox challenged. You seem to know more about this than you're letting on. Glaze's gaze drifted towards a section of wall where the old wallpaper, patterned with faded roses, was peeling away to reveal the dark, stained lath beneath. Their aesthetic is different. Their understanding of structure, of purpose. It's not for human habitation as you understand it. He paused. This house, your client's house, is built upon a place where the barriers are thin, perhaps a wound in the world. They were here first in their way. You are the intruders. Intruders, Val scoffed. We were hired to fix this dump. Your definition of fix and theirs may be fundamentally incompatible, Glaze replied calmly. The pulsing seemed to intensify slightly. From upstairs there came a sudden, sharp crack, like a large timber splitting under immense pressure, followed by a sound like 1,000 marbles cascading down a wooden chute. Then silence, save for the incessant, deep throb. Jewel, who had been edging closer to the front door, finally broke. That's it, I'm done. He threw the length of conduit he'd been holding onto a pile of debris with a clatter. I signed up to be an electrician, not a ghostbuster or a dimensional surveyor. I've got a family. This place ain't worth my sanity or my life. He looked at Maddox, his face pale but resolute. Sorry, Mad, I'm out. Pip looked like he wanted to join Jewel, but a sense of loyalty to Maddox, or perhaps a deeper fear of being alone, kept him rooted to the spot. Corvus and Val exchanged uneasy glances but didn't move. Maddox couldn't blame Jewel. He felt the same suffocating pressure, the same urge to flee. But the stubborn part of him, the part that had built a business from scratch, refused to be beaten so easily. All right, Jewel, I get it, he sighed. Go, I'll sort out your pay. Jewel nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He didn't waste any time, practically bolting out the front door. The sound of his van starting and speeding away was unnaturally loud in the ensuing quiet. One man down, Maddox wondered who would be next. So now what? Val asked, his voice subdued. Without Sparky, the whole electrical side is stalled. Before Maddox could answer, Glaze, who had been staring intently at that section of peeling wallpaper, stepped forward. There's something here, he murmured, reaching out. He touched the wall. His fingers pressed against the lath, then seemed to pass through it. He drew his hand back, and in his fingers he held a small, rolled-up piece of parchment-like material. It was a pale, almost luminous gray, and felt strangely cool to the touch. What is that? Maddox asked, approaching cautiously. Glaze carefully unrolled it. It wasn't parchment or paper. The material was thin, flexible, yet incredibly resilient, with a texture like fine, cool silk mixed with something metallic. Drawn upon its surface in lines of a darker, shimmering gray was a diagram. It was unmistakably a blueprint, but like none Maddox had ever seen. The lines were intricate, forming impossible angles and curves that defied Euclidean geometry. There were symbols that resembled a cross between mathematical equations and ancient runes. The layout it depicted was vaguely reminiscent of the Gable House's footprint, but distorted, alien. Rooms flowed into one another without doors, spiraling into central vortexes. Walls were depicted as porous, shifting membranes. There was a sense of organic structure, like the inside of some colossal, unknown creature. This, Glaze breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. This is theirs, their plan. Maddock, Corvus, Val, and Pip crowded around, staring at the bizarre blueprint. The faint, rhythmic pulsing of the house seemed to resonate with the shimmering lines on the strange material. "What is this thing made of?" Val asked, reaching out a hesitant finger to touch it, then snatching it back as if from a mild shock. "Feels tingly." "It's a projection, I think," Glaze said. "A temporary manifestation of their design bled through from their side, perhaps dislodged by the activity upstairs." He indicated the crack and the cascading sound they'd heard. Pip pointed to a section of the alien blueprint that roughly corresponded to the parlor they were standing in. "Look, that twisting thing in the middle. Is that what they're building here?" In the diagram, the center of the parlor-like space was dominated by a complex, spiraling structure that seemed to draw all other lines into its core. Maddock felt a profound sense of dread. This wasn't just haphazard haunting. This was organized, intelligent. The counter-artisan, as he was beginning to think of the unseen entity, had a vision for this house, a terrifyingly alien vision. Corvus traced a gnarled finger over a section of the blueprint. "These symbols, they almost look like a language." As if in response to his touch, the symbols on the parchment glowed brighter for a moment, and a faint, whispering sound emanated from it, too rapid and too complex to be understood, like 1,000 voices speaking at once in a language not meant for human ears. They all recoiled. "Don't touch it too much," Glaze warned, his voice hushed. "It's reactive." The pulsing in the house grew stronger, the throb becoming more insistent. The floor vibrated more noticeably. A loose piece of plaster fell from the ceiling, shattering on the floor. Suddenly, the blueprint in Glaze's hands began to curl at the edges, as if retracting. The shimmering lines faded, the whispers ceased. Within seconds, the strange material had shrunk, then dissolved into a fine gray mist that dissipated into the air, leaving only a faint, cold spot where it had been. They stared at the empty space, then at each other. "It took it back," Pip whispered. "They know we saw it." "They wanted us to see it," Glaze corrected, his eyes narrowed in thought. "It was a message, a statement of intent." "A warning, more like," Corvus muttered, gripping his hammer tighter. Maddock felt a shift within himself. The fear was still there, a cold weight in his gut, but now it was mixed with a defiant anger. This was his job site. He had plans, legitimate human plans. He wouldn't be scared off by some interdimensional squatter and its creepy blueprints. "All right," Maddox said, his voice hard. "They've got their plans, we've got ours." He slammed his fist into his palm. "We're building our wall right here, right now." He pointed to the curved, distorted chalk lines. "Snap new lines, straight ones, and we reinforce them. We're going to build a wall so solid no damn echo or shadow is going to push it around." Val looked at him, a new respect dawning in his eyes. "You're serious, Mad." "Deadly serious," Maddock replied. "They want to fight for this space. They'll get one." Corvus grinned, a fierce, almost feral expression. "Now you're talking, boss. Let's give these spooks something to think about." Even Pip seemed to draw strength from Maddox's resolve, his fear giving way to a nervous determination. Glaze watched them, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, admiration, perhaps, or pity. "Be careful, Maddox grieves," he said softly. "You are challenging a force that built the scaffolding of nightmares long before your world was conceived. Their tools are not hammers and nails, but the very fabric of possibility." Maddox ignored him. He grabbed the chalk line from Pip. "Let's get to work." As they began to snap new, defiant blue lines over the faint, ghostly curves of the old ones, the poolsing in the house seemed to pause, as if in surprise. Then it resumed, slower now, deeper, like the deliberate intake of breath before a roar. The battle for the Gable House, for its very structure and reality, had just been explicitly joined. Chapter 6: The Inverted Apprentice. The decision to directly challenge the unseen forces in the Gable House injected a strange, defiant energy into the remaining crew. Maddox, Val, Corvus, and even Pip worked with a focused intensity, driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and a primal stubbornness. Glaze Finch watched them, a silent observer, occasionally offering cryptic advice that Maddox mostly ignored. They snapped new chalk lines for the parlor partition, bright blue and resolutely straight, sometimes directly over the faint, mocking curves left by the house's influence. "Double studs," Maddox ordered. "Anchor plates bolted to the floor joists. I want this wall to be a fortress." As Corvus and Val began measuring and cutting the fresh lumber, the rhythmic poolsing in the house, which had briefly paused, resumed with a new, heavier cadence. It felt less like a heartbeat now and more like the slow, grinding of immense gears deep within the earth beneath them. The air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic scent, like ozone or blood. Pip, tasked with bringing in more lumber from the truck, was the first to encounter the new manifestation. He just stepped back into the foyer, his arms loaded with 2x4s when he saw it. Standing in the archway to the parlor, where moments before there had been only empty space, was a figure. It was translucent, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt, but with a definite form. It was roughly human-shaped, its proportions similar to Pip's own but elongated, stretched, as if seen through flawed glass. It wore what looked like a spectral version of a tool belt, though the tools hanging from it were indistinct, shadowy oblongs. This was not the imposing shadow foreman they'd glimpsed before. This was something different, something that felt directly opposite. Pip froze, the lumber nearly slipping from his grasp. "Mad," he choked out. The figure in the archway moved. It raised a shimmering arm, its hand holding a tool that vaguely resembled a hammer, though it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. With slow, deliberate motions, the figure began to unbuild the section of wall that Corvus had just started to frame. As Corvus drove a nail into a stud, the figure would make a corresponding reversed motion. The nail, instead of seating, would slowly, silently retract from the wood, as if drawn out by an invisible magnet. A freshly cut stud, carefully placed by Val, would gently lift from its position and float back towards the lumber pile, rotating slowly as it went. It was a perfect, silent, mirrored deconstruction, each of their construction efforts instantly, effortlessly undone by this inverted apprentice, as Pip immediately, terrifyingly, dubbed it in his mind. Maddox, Corvus, and Val, alerted by Pip's cry, turned. They saw the shimmering figure, saw the nails backing out, the studs drifting. "What in the blazes?" Corvus exclaimed, lowering his hammer, staring at the nail that had just slithered out of the wood as if it had a life of its own. The inverted apprentice continued its work, its movements fluid and economical, a horrifying parody of their own labor. It didn't acknowledge them, it simply undid. Maddox felt a surge of rage. "Hey," he yelled, stepping towards the archway. "Get away from that wall." He waved his hammer threateningly. The figure didn't react to his voice. As Maddox approached, however, the air around the shimmering form grew intensely cold. He got within a few feet and felt a physical pressure, an invisible barrier pushing him back, stronger than the unseen scaffolding they'd encountered before. It was like leaning into a gale-force wind made of ice. It's him, but not," Pip stammered, his face ashen. "It's doing everything backwards." Val tried to reseat one of the floating studs. As his hand closed around the wood, the inverted apprentice made a subtle gesture, and the stud twisted in Val's grip, wrenching his wrist painfully. Val yelped, letting go. The stud then serenely continued its journey back to the pile. "It's actively fighting us now," Maddox said through gritted teeth, the cold pressure making his eyes water. "It's not just shifting lines or taking tools, it's unmaking what we make right in front of us." Glaze Finch stepped forward, his expression unusually grim. "This is a direct countermeasure. The counter-artisan is deploying more sophisticated defenses. This entity, it exists in a reversed temporal flow relative to this specific point of construction." "Reversed what?" Corvus growled, rubbing his own wrist where he tried to grab a retreating nail and felt a sharp, burning cold. "It perceives your actions of building as its own actions of unbuilding in its own time stream," Glaze explained, his gaze fixed on the shimmering figure. "It's not malicious in the way you understand it. It's simply performing its task as dictated by the other blueprint. So we build, it unbuilds. We're stuck in a bloody loop," Maddox said, frustration boiling over. He swung his hammer at the space where the figure stood. The hammer passed through the shimmering form with a faint, sucking sound and a burst of frigid air, but the figure itself was unaffected, continuing its work of meticulous deconstruction. Maddox's arm throbbed from the sudden, icy resistance. "Direct physical confrontation is inadvisable," Glaze stated calmly, "and likely futile. You are trying to hit a shadow that is also a reflection of your own efforts cast from another dimension." For the next hour they tried everything. They tried working faster, hopping to overwhelm the inverted apprentice. It simply sped up its own movements, its shimmering form becoming a blur as it plucked nails from the air and guided lumber back to its stacks. They tried working on different sections of the wall simultaneously. Spectral, shimmering hands appeared, matching their efforts with reversed precision. They tried shouting, throwing tools which passed harmlessly through or were gently repelled, even pleading. The inverted apprentice remained implacable, a silent, efficient engine of anti-construction. The pile of unused lumber grew, while the section of framed wall diminished, stud by stud, nail by nail. The air in the parlor grew bitingly cold, frost beginning to form on the nearby windows, even on their tools. The rhythmic, grinding pulse of the house seemed to deepen, resonating with the inverted apprentice's work. Corvus finally threw his hammer down in disgust. This is pointless, mad. We're like squirrels trying to bury nuts in a river. It's just not gonna happen. His breath plumed in the frigid air. Val, his face grim, nodded in agreement. It's got us beat here. We can't build if it can unbuild faster and without touching anything. Pip was shivering, huddled near a small pile of wood shavings, his eyes wide with a kind of horrified fascination as he watched the shimmering entity continue its task, even though they had stopped working. It was now meticulously unstacking the lumber they had brought in, as if returning it to a pre-delivered state. Maddox felt a crushing sense of defeat. Glaze had been right. They were challenging a force beyond their comprehension, a force that could literally unwind their reality. He looked at the empty space where their wall should have been, where only their straight, defiant chalk lines remained on the floor, now looking pathetic and futile. There must be a way, Maddox muttered, more to himself than anyone. There has to be something it can't undo. Glaze, who had been observing the inverted apprentice with an almost scientific detachment, spoke. Its influence seems localized, tied to the direct act of your construction in this specific area. Perhaps it cannot affect what is already complete in a way that transcends simple assembly. What does that mean, Glaze? Speak English, man. Maddox snapped, his nerves raw. The blueprint you saw, the one from the other side, Glaze elaborated, his gaze thoughtful. It depicted finished forms, however alien. This entity, this unmaker, seems to be a guardian of the process, preventing your process from interfering with theirs. But what if you were to introduce something already whole, something it cannot deconstruct into its component parts because it perceives it as a singular, already existing object in their reality as well? Maddox frowned. Like what? We can't bring in prefabricated walls for this old wreck. Glaze's eyes drifted towards the fireplace, a massive, soot-stained brick structure that dominated one wall of the parlor. Some things have a stronger presence, a deeper anchor in the house's history, things that have endured. Perhaps it cannot so easily unmake what is already intrinsically part of the house's older fabric, or something that resonates with the other sides. Permanence. An idea, desperate and outlandish, began to form in Maddox's mind. The fireplace. It was old, solid, part of the original construction. What if? The old stones, Maddox said slowly, looking at the piles of salvaged stone and brick from the demolished internal chimney stacks they'd taken down in the early days. They'd planned to haul it away as rubble. The original stonework of the house. What if we use that? What if we build something with the house's own bones? Corvus looked skeptical. You want us to become masons now, mad? And what would we build with old chimney bricks that this thing wouldn't just unstack? Not unstack, Maddox said, the idea gaining momentum. We integrate. We make it part of something it already recognizes as belonging. He looked at the empty space where their partition wall was supposed to be. We build pillars, solid stone pillars using the house's original material, something that feels less like an imposition and more like an echo of what's already here. Glaze nodded slowly, a flicker of interest in his eyes. An interesting hypothesis, Mr. Greaves, using the house's own essence against its, or the other house's, current manifestation. It might perceive such structures differently, less as an invasion, more as a realignment. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than the soul-crushing futility of their current efforts. "Pip, Corvus, start hauling those old stones in here," Maddock ordered, a new resolve hardening his voice. "Val, mix up some mortar. We're going to try something different." As they began to gather the old, soot-stained stones, the inverted apprentice paused in its task of unstacking lumber. It turned its shimmering, translucent head slowly, as if sensing a shift in their intentions. The grinding pulse of the house seemed to hesitate. The frigid air in the room did not warm, but the oppressive sense of active, direct opposition lessened almost imperceptibly. The battle had shifted. They were no longer trying to impose their will with fresh, alien materials. They were attempting a strange kind of negotiation, using the house's own history as their medium. Maddock didn't know if it would work, but as he hefted the first heavy, worn stone, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt for days. A sliver of hope, as fragile and as cold as the frost on the window panes. Chapter 7: The Stone Resonance. The decision to use the house's original stones brought a palpable change to the atmosphere in the parlor, though not necessarily a comforting one. The inverted apprentice ceased its meticulous unstacking of their fresh lumber. It remained a shimmering, translucent presence in the archway, its indistinct gaze fixed on the crew as they began to move the old, soot-stained bricks and stones from the demolished chimney stacks. The grinding pulse of the house, which had hesitated, now resumed, but its rhythm was different, slower, more questioning, like a vast intelligence contemplating a new, unexpected variable. The intense cold remained, but the active, personal opposition from the unmaker seemed to be observing. Val, grumbling about his plumbing skills being wasted on amateur masonry, mixed a batch of mortar in a wheelbarrow, the scrape of his shovel unnaturally loud. Corvus and Pip, their faces smudged with soot, hauled the heavy, irregular stones, creating rough piles near the stubbornly straight chalk lines Maddock had snapped. Maddock picked up a particularly large, fire-blackened keystone, its surface rough and cool beneath his gloves. He envisioned his plan: two solid, almost primitive stone pillars rising from the floor to where the ceiling joists would be, defining the edge of the new partition. Not a wall, but a demarcation, built from the house's own flesh and blood. "All right," Maddox said, placing the keystone carefully at the start of one chalk line. "Let's see what happens." He troweled a layer of Val's mortar onto the stone. As he did, the inverted apprentice tilted its shimmering head. Maddox took another stone, smaller this time, and set it onto the mortar bed. He tapped it into place with the handle of his trowel. Nothing happened. The stones remained. The inverted apprentice did not move to unset them. A collective, quiet sigh of relief went through the small crew. Pip even managed a weak smile. It's letting us," Pip whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. Glaze Finch, who had been watching the proceedings with intense concentration, nodded slowly. The resonance is different. These stones, they belong. They are part of the house's deeper memory, its intrinsic structure. The counter-artisan and its servant here may not perceive this as an entirely alien act. He paused. Or it is waiting to see your intent. Encouraged, they worked with a renewed, albeit cautious, energy. Maddock, relying on a half-forgotten stonemasonry course he'd taken years ago, directed the placement of each stone. Corvus, with his carpenter's eye, helped keep the emerging pillars relatively plumb. Val supplied the mortar, and Pip, with surprising strength, kept them supplied with the heavy, awkward stones. It was slow, painstaking work. The old stones were irregular, demanding careful selection and fitting. The mortar oozed and splattered. But as the first pillar began to rise, course by course, a strange thing began to happen. The stones, cold and inert when first handled, seemed to warm slightly as they were set into place. Not physically hot, but the chilling aura that had permeated the room began to recede from their immediate vicinity. The air around the slowly growing pillars felt less hostile. Moreover, as Maddock fitted one dark, oddly shaped stone against another, he sometimes felt a faint, almost imperceptible vibration pass from the stone into his hands, a subtle thrum that resonated deep in his bones. It wasn't unpleasant. It felt like a form of communication, a recognition. The inverted apprentice remained in the archway, watching. Its shimmering form seemed less agitated, its elongated limbs still. Its attention was entirely on the pillars. By midday, the first pillar stood nearly 4 feet high, a rough, solid column of history. Maddox stepped back to examine their work. It was crude, certainly not fine masonry, but it was undeniably there, solid, and untouched by any deconstructive influence. "It's working," Val said, a note of disbelief in his voice wiping sweat and mortar from his brow. "I'll be damned, it's actually working." As if to punctuate his words, the deep, grinding pulse of the house softened, the rhythm becoming less like grinding gears and more like the slow, deep breathing of a slumbering giant. The oppressive atmosphere in the parlor lifted perceptibly. Glaze walked slowly around the pillar, his hand hovering just above the stones. They are accepting it, or at least tolerating it. The stones are creating a sympathetic vibration, bridging the disharmony perhaps. His eyes met Maddox. "You are speaking to the house in a language it understands, Mr. Greaves. A language older than your blueprints." Maddox didn't fully grasp Glaze's mystical explanations, but he couldn't deny the results. The unmaker was quiescent. The stones felt almost alive in his hands. They broke for a quick lunch, eating sandwiches amidst the dust and debris, their conversation hushed, almost reverent. The inverted apprentice remained, a silent, shimmering sentinel. When they resumed work on the second pillar, the atmosphere had changed further. The earlier tension was replaced by a kind of focused calm. The house still felt ancient, alien, but less actively malevolent. The stones seemed to settle into place more easily. The vibrations Maddox felt becoming more distinct, almost like a faint, complex music resonating through them. He found himself choosing stones not just for fit, but for a certain feel, Some seemed to hum faintly in his grip, others pulsed with a slow warmth. Corvus, too, seemed to be experiencing something. "This one," he said, holding up a triangular, iron-stained stone, "feels right for this spot." He placed it, and it fitted perfectly, as if it had been waiting for that exact position. Even Pip, bringing a smaller stone, paused. "This one's sad," he murmured, looking at a piece of gray, water-smoothed rock. He placed it gently on the growing pillar. Glaze observed them, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You are becoming attuned. The house, it is beginning to incorporate you into its own narrative as you incorporate it into yours." By late afternoon, both pillars stood nearly complete, rough-hewn but undeniably present, reaching almost to the ceiling. They were strange, archaic features in the ravaged modernity of the renovation site, yet they felt more a part of the Gable House than any of the fresh lumber or new wiring. As Maddock placed the final capstone on the second pillar, a profound silence fell over the room. The deep breathing pulse of the house faded into stillness. The inverted apprentice in the archway flickered, its form becoming less distinct, more like heat haze. Then, with a final, almost imperceptible shimmer, it was gone. The archway stood empty. The intense cold it had generated dissipated, leaving the parlor air merely cool and dusty. Maddock, Val, Corvus, and Pip stood there, dirty, tired, and stunned, looking at the two stone pillars. They had done it. They had built something the house, and its other-dimensional counterpart, had accepted. "It's gone," Pip whispered, staring at the empty archway. "It has withdrawn its immediate attention," Glaze clarified. "Your act of resonant construction has, for the moment, satisfied or neutralized the immediate perceived threat to their design." He looked at the pillars with an expression of deep thought. "These are more than mere supports now, Mr. Greaves. They are conduits, anchors. They have harmonized to a degree the two realities that meet in this place." Maddock felt an exhaustion so profound it was almost a physical blow. He leaned against one of the pillars. The stone felt cool and solid beneath his hand, and the faint, deep thrumming was still there, a quiet song within the rock. He didn't understand half of what Glaze said, but he knew they had achieved something extraordinary, something that went far beyond a simple construction job. "So, what now?" Val asked, voicing the question that hung in the air. Do we keep building with rocks?" Maddock looked around the parlor. The distorted chalk lines were still visible on the floor. The piles of fresh lumber lay untouched. The new windows reflected the late afternoon light, no longer showing terrifying visions, but simply the quiet, dusty room. "Now," Maddox said slowly, "I think we try to talk to Mr. Gable again, because this changes things, this changes everything." He had faced down something monstrous, not with force, but with an intuitive understanding he hadn't known he possessed. But the victory felt precarious, temporary. The counter-artisan was still out there, its vast, alien intelligence still focused on the Gable House. They had won a battle, using the house's own ancient language. But the war for the soul of this place, and for their own sanity, was far from over. The stone pillars stood as silent testament, resonating with an agreement forged in a place between worlds, an agreement whose terms were still terrifyingly unclear. The silence of the Gable House returned, but it was different now. Not empty, not waiting. It was listening. And perhaps for the first time it was also being heard. Chapter 8. The Pillar's Murmur. The quiet that descended after the inverted apprentice vanished was profound, yet it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, of an immense, unseen audience waiting for the next act. Maddox Greaves stood with Val Calder, Corvus Blackwood, and a visibly shaken Pip Sorrel, all four men coated in a mixture of soot, mortar, and sweat. The two stone pillars they had erected rose from the dusty parlor floor like ancient, weathered sentinels, their surfaces cool and faintly humming beneath Maddox's touch. The raw, biting cold that had accompanied the unmaker was gone, replaced by the familiar damp chill of the neglected Gable House. "Well," Corvus finally said, breaking the spell, his voice raspy. He spat a glob of mortar-tinged saliva onto the floor. "That was a shift I ain't keen on repeating." He eyed the pillars with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "So these rock piles, they scared it off." Glaze Finch, who had been examining the capstone of the nearest pillar with an almost reverent intensity, shook his head. "Not scared, appeased, or perhaps intrigued. You've engaged with the house, Mr. Greaves, on a level it understands. These pillars are not just stone and mortar. They are resonant structures. They have, in a small way, begun to harmonize the dissonance between this space and the other." Maddox grunted, pulling out his phone again. The screen was smudged with grime. "Harmonized or not, I'm getting Gable on the line. He needs to know what kind of three-ring circus he bought." He scrolled to win Gable's contact and pressed dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the fourth ring, just as Maddox expected it to go to voicemail, there was a click. But it wasn't Gable's voice. It was a sound, a series of rapid, clicking, almost chittering noises, overlaid with a faint, high-pitched whine like tortured machinery. It lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, then the line went dead. Maddox stared at his phone, a cold dread seeping into him, more profound than the unmaker's chill. What was that? Pip, who had been closest, looked alarmed. "Sounded bad, mad, real bad, like interference, but angrier." Maddox tried again. This time the call went straight to a generic network message. "The number you have dialed is not currently reachable. Please try again later." "He's turned it off, or—" Val began, then trailed off, looking uneasy. "Or the house doesn't want him talking," Corvus muttered, glancing around the room, his gaze lingering on the dark archways leading to other parts of the house. Glaze's expression was somber. "The connections here are pervasive. It is possible Mr. Gable is temporarily indisposed, or that the influence of this place extends beyond its physical boundaries, especially through means of communication." Maddox slammed his phone down on a stack of unused lumber. "Damn it, so we're on our own with this madhouse." His earlier surge of defiant energy was ebbing, replaced by a weary frustration. The stone pillars stood as a testament to a small victory, but what did it mean if they couldn't even contact the man paying the bills? What if Gable was a victim himself, swallowed by the house's deepening mystery? "So, boss," Pip asked, his voice small, "what's the play? We can't keep building with rocks, can we? The whole house can't be pillars." Maddox looked at the pillars, then at the piles of fresh, unused framing lumber. The original plans, the client's specifications, seemed like artifacts from a different, saner world. I don't know, Pip, for now. Let's clean up this mess, bag the debris, stack the usable lumber neatly. He needed time to think, to process the impossible events of the day. He needed to figure out how to operate in a reality where the laws of physics seemed to be mere suggestions, and the primary building inspector was a trans-dimensional entity. They worked in a subdued quiet for the next hour. The simple, mundane tasks of sweeping and stacking were a small comfort, a return to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the presence of the two stone pillars dominated the room, a constant reminder of the thin veil between their world and another. As Maddock was coiling an extension cord, he noticed Glaze standing very still beside one of the pillars, his head cocked, as if listening intently. Glaze's eyes were unfocused, his expression one of deep concentration. "Glaze, you all right?" Maddock asked. Glaze slowly raised a hand, gesturing for silence. He leaned closer to the pillar, his ear almost touching the cool, soot-stained stone. Maddock, Corvus, Val, and Pip watched him, a new unease settling over them. After a long moment, Glaze straightened, his eyes slowly refocusing. There was a strange look on his face, a mixture of wonder and profound concern. "The pillars," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "They are not just anchors, they are listening posts. And now they are beginning to speak, or rather to relay." "Relay what?" Corvus demanded, stepping closer, though he kept a wary distance from the pillar Glaze had been listening to. "Murmurs," Glaze said, "faint from the other side, not voices, not yet, but intentions, concepts, images almost translated into a kind of tactile thought." He touched the pillar again very gently. "It's like feeling the shape of an idea." Maddock felt a prickle of alarm. "And what ideas are they relaying, Glaze?" Glaze was silent for another moment, his brow furrowed. "The counter-artisan, it acknowledges your offering." He gestured to the pillars. "It perceives your use of the original stone not as an act of defiance, but as an act of understanding. A rudimentary one, but an understanding nonetheless." "So it's happy with us now?" Val asked, a hopeful note in his voice. Glaze's faint smile was unsettling. "Happy is not a word I would use. It is evaluating. It sees a potential for synergy. It is suggesting modifications to your existing plans, ways to integrate your work more harmoniously with its own unfolding design." Pip shivered. "It's telling us how to build now, through the rocks." "The pillars are resonating with its core structure, its energetic template," Glaze explained, his gaze distant. "They are conveying subtle impulses, guiding notions. If you were to work with fresh lumber now near these pillars, you might find your hands guided, your measurements subtly altered, your designs influenced." Maddox stared at the pillar, then at the stack of fresh 2x4s. The thought of his own hands being guided by an alien intelligence, of his carefully planned structures being warped to fit some monstrous, unseen blueprint, was deeply repulsive. "No," Maddox said firmly. "Absolutely not. We build to our plans, human plans, not to the whispers of some rock pile channeling another dimension." Corvus nodded. I ain't taking architectural advice from a spooky rock, neither. Last thing we need is to build a doorway for something worse than that shiny unmaker thing. Glaze looked from Maddock to Corvus, then to the pillars. The influence may not be overt, it may be insidious, a gradual alignment. You might not even realize your designs are changing, diverging from your original intent until they begin to reflect the aesthetic of the other place. He gestured around the room. This house desires a certain completion, a specific form. Your efforts to impose a different form have been met with resistance. Now it offers collaboration. On its terms, of course. A new, more subtle horror began to creep into Maddock. The overt attacks, the deconstruction, the chilling manifestations, those were terrifying. But at least they were tangible, something to fight against. This idea of a slow, unseen corruption of their work, of their own minds and intentions, was far more disturbing. "So what do you suggest, Glaze?" Maddock asked, his voice tight. "We pack up and leave. Let it have its harmonious design." That felt like surrender, and every stubborn bone in his body rebelled against it. "Leaving is certainly an option," Glaze conceded. "Perhaps the wisest one. However," he paused, looking at the twin pillars with a complex expression, "there is also an unprecedented opportunity here to learn, to understand something about the fundamental nature of reality, about the spaces between worlds. Few are ever granted such intimate access." "I'm a builder, Glaze, not a bloody scholar of the occult," Maddock retorted. "I just want to finish this job, get paid, and never see this god-forsaken house again." "This house, Mr. Greaves, may have other ideas about your departure," Glaze said softly, "and about what finishing the job truly entails." As if on cue, a faint, almost melodic humming began to emanate from the two stone pillars. It wasn't the deep, grinding pulse from before, nor was it the unsettling whispers of the alien blueprint. This was a series of complex, resonant tones, almost like a form of alien music. It was strangely beautiful, yet profoundly unsettling. The air around the pillars seemed to shimmer faintly, and the intricate patterns of soot and age on the stones themselves seemed to shift and swirl, as if the rock were slowly breathing. Pip, who had been staring at one of the pillars, his mouth slightly agape, suddenly reached out a hand as if mesmerized. It's pretty." "Pip, don't," Maddock barked, grabbing the young man's arm and pulling him back. Pip blinked, shaking his head as if coming out of a trance. What happened?" Pip asked, looking disoriented. "It's trying to draw you in," Corvus said. His eyes narrowed at the humming pillars. "Trying to sweet-talk us, now that the scary stuff didn't send us all running." The humming continued, its complex harmonies filling the parlor. It wasn't overtly threatening, yet it felt deeply invasive, a siren song composed in a language of pure geometry and alien intent. Maddock realized with a chilling certainty that the house, the counter-artisan, had simply changed its tactics. The direct assault had failed. Now it was attempting seduction, a subtle reshaping of their will through these newly activated conduits. The never-ending construction had just entered a new, more insidious phase. The battle was no longer for physical space, but for their very perception, their intent, their agency. And the house, with its ancient stones and otherworldly murmurs, was playing a long, patient game. Chapter 9: Gable's Legacy. The melodic, unsettling humming from the stone pillars continued for several minutes, a siren song attempting to lull the remaining crew into a state of passive acceptance. Maddox Greaves fought against its strange allure, the almost hypnotic quality of the tones that seemed to resonate directly with the bones in his skull. He kept a firm grip on Pip's arm, grounding the younger man, while Val and Corvus stared at the pillars with a mixture of suspicion and an unwilling fascination. "We need to get out of this room," Maddox said, his voice tight, struggling to cut through the invasive harmonies. "The air here, it's too thick with whatever that is." Glaze Finch, though seemingly less affected by the direct psychic pressure of the humming, nodded in agreement. "The pillars are currently active conduits. Distance would be prudent until their transmission subsides." With a concerted effort, Maddox guided Pip towards the foyer, Val and Corvus following close behind, casting wary glances back at the vibrating, humming stonework. As they stepped out of the parlor, the intensity of the sound lessened, though its presence still thrummed at the edges of their hearing, a constant, subtle pressure. "What was that?" Val asked, rubbing his temples. "Felt like my brain was being flossed with a cello string." "It's influencing us," Maddox said grimly. "Trying to tune us to its frequency. Glaze, how do we stop it?" Glaze considered this, his gaze distant. "You cannot stop it in a conventional sense. You have awakened a deeper level of the house's consciousness or its connection to the other side. The pillars are now active. You might be able to dampen their influence, disrupt the resonance. But to silence them completely would require dismantling them, and I suspect the house would react poorly to the destruction of what it perceives as an accepted offering. So we're stuck with humming rocks that want to rewrite our brains," Corvus growled. "Swell." Maddox felt a rising tide of desperation. He was a builder, a problem solver. But this problem was unlike anything he had ever faced. Every solution seemed to lead to a more complex, more insidious entanglement with the house and its unseen master. He thought again of Win Gable, their absent client. The bizarre, clicking call, then the unreachable number. "Gable," Maddox said, a new urgency in his voice. "We need to find out what happened to Gable. If this house can do all this." He waved a hand, encompassing the strange events, the unmaker, the pillars, the humming. "Then what could it have done to him? His office. He's got a local office, right? Over on Mill Street." Val nodded. "Yeah, Gable Real Estate. Small place. Think he's the only one who works there." "Right," Maddox decided. "Val, you're with me. We're going to Gable's office. Corvus, Pip, you two stay here. Keep an eye on things. Don't go near those pillars if they start their concert again. If anything at all out of the ordinary happens, you get out. Don't wait, just run. Meet us back at the diner on the corner." Agreed. Corvus and Pip exchanged uneasy looks but nodded. The thought of splitting up was unsettling, but the need to understand Gable's involvement or his fate was pressing. Glaze Finch, unbidden, announced, "I will remain as well. My observations here are incomplete." Maddox didn't argue. He wasn't sure if Glaze was a help or a hindrance, but the glazier seemed to possess a unique insight into the house's machinations, and perhaps his presence offered some strange form of protection, or at least early warning. Maddox and Val left the Gable house, the faint, melodic humming of the pillars still a ghostly echo in their ears. The late afternoon sun felt unnaturally bright. The normal sounds of the city, distant traffic, birdsong, jarringly mundane after the oppressive, alien atmosphere of the house. Gable Real Estate was a modest, single-story building tucked between a dry cleaner and a bakery. The blinds were drawn, and a closed sign hung crookedly in the window. Maddox tried the door. Locked. "Doesn't look like anyone's here," Val observed. Maddox peered through a gap in the blinds. The office was small, cluttered. A desk, a few filing cabinets, a wilting potted plant. Nothing seemed overtly out of place, but the stillness, the drawn blinds in the middle of a weekday, felt wrong. He rattled the door handle again, more forcefully. A muffled voice came from within. "We're closed, go away." It was faint, strained. Maddox's heart lurched. "Gable, when Gable, is that you?" "It's Maddox Greaves from the renovation." There was a long pause. Then the sound of shuffling, a fumbled clicking, and the door opened a few inches, held by a security chain. When Gable's face appeared in the gap, he looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot and wide with a frantic, hunted expression. His usually neat hair was disheveled and his skin was pale and clammy. He was unshaven, wearing a stained undershirt. "Greaves," Gable whispered, his voice hoarse. "What do you want? I told you. The work. Just get it done." "Mr. Gable, we need to talk. There are problems at the house, serious problems." Maddox tried to keep his voice calm. "And that call earlier, what was that?" Gable's eyes darted nervously past Maddox up and down the street. "Problems? What problems? The house is fine, old but fine." He licked his lips. "The call, bad connection, storms up north messing with the lines." His explanation was weak, unconvincing. "Mr. Gable, with respect, that's bull," Val interjected, his patience wearing thin. "That house is. It's not right. Things are happening there, things that ain't natural." Gable flinched at Val's bluntness. He started to close the door. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm busy. Go away." Maddox put his foot in the door, preventing it from closing. "No, Mr. Gable, we're not leaving until you tell us what you know. That house. It's fighting us. It's changing things. We found a blueprint, not ours. We've seen things and those phone calls. Something's wrong and you're scared. Scared of that house." Gable's face crumpled. The fear in his eyes intensified, mixed with a desperate exhaustion. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. You can't understand." "Then make us understand, Mr. Gable," Maddox pressed, gently but firmly. "What is that place? Why were you so desperate to have it renovated quickly?" Gable looked over his shoulder into the dimness of his office as if expecting something to materialize there. He leaned closer to the gap in the door, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, terrified whisper. "It's not a house, not really. It's a gateway, a thinning. My grandfather, he knew. He dabbled in things he shouldn't have. The order of the esoteric convergence it. He thought he could control it, harness it. He built the house as a focusing lens." Maddox and Val exchanged bewildered glances. "A focusing lens for what?" Maddox asked. For them, Gable breathed, his eyes wide and unfocused. The others, the shapers from beyond, he wanted to draw their attention, their power. He thought they'd bring enlightenment, a new age. Gable let out a choked, hysterical laugh. He was a fool. They're not enlightening, they're consuming. The counter-artisan, Maddock muttered, Glaze's term suddenly taking on a more sinister weight. Gable nodded frantically. Yes, that's what he called their architect, their prime intelligence. It designs, it shapes. It wants to remake this world in its image, starting with that house. My grandfather, he tried to stop it once he realized what he'd unleashed. He performed a ritual, a binding. It held them back mostly. Kept them as echoes, shadows, but the binding is weakening. The house is waking up, becoming more like their side. And the renovation, Val asked, why speed it up? The ritual, Gable explained, his voice trembling. It's tied to the fabric of the house, its original structure. I found his journals. He wrote that certain realignments, certain restorations of the original design combined with modern materials could reinforce the binding, hold them back for another generation. I thought, I hoped. A fast renovation strengthening the core would be enough before it fully woke. He wrung his hands. But it's too late. It knows it's fighting back. It's trying to complete its own design. The pieces clicked into place for Maddock. The house's resistance, the unmaker, the alien blueprint, the pillars. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a dimensional battleground with Gable's mad ancestor at the heart of it. The phone calls, Gable, Maddock pressed. The clicking, were they trying to get to you through the phone? Gable shuddered violently. It speaks. Sometimes, not in words, in thoughts, images, that clicking. It's them trying to get in, to make me a channel like it did to my grandfather before he died in that house, trying to undo what he'd done. He looked at Maddock with pleading eyes. You have to reinforce the binding, the plans my grandfather left, the specific points in the house. If you build them correctly, it might hold them. It might save us. Save us, Maddock's voice was hard. You threw us in there blind, Gable. You knew what that place was and you let us walk into it unprepared for any of this. I was desperate, Gable cried, tears welling in his eyes. I thought if the work was done fast enough, the worst of it wouldn't manifest. I'd pay anything, I will pay anything. He fumbled with the chain, then unlatched it, pulling the door open wider. He gestured them into the dim, cluttered office. Piles of old books and strange, occult-looking diagrams were scattered on his desk and floor. His journals, the plans for the reinforcement. They're here. Take them, please. You're builders. You understand structure. You might be the only ones who can stop it now. He pointed to a thick, leather-bound journal lying open on the desk, its pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting and bizarre, geometric drawings. Beside it lay a roll of yellowed architectural plans, annotated with the same strange symbols they'd seen on the counter-artisan's blueprint. This is insane, Val breathed, staring at the occult paraphernalia. Maddock picked up the journal. The page it was open to described a keystone of warding to be placed at the southern convergence point, which corresponded to the parlor. It spoke of using stones of original lineage, imbued with the house's own spirit. The pillars, Maddock realized aloud. We accidentally started part of his ritual by using the old stones. Gable nodded eagerly. Yes, that must be it. The house's spirit. It's trying to help, trying to guide you to restore the balance. His hope was pathetic, desperate. But Maddock also remembered Glaze's words. The pillars were conduits, relaying the counterartisan's intentions, its desire for a harmonious design. Was the house's spirit guiding them, or was the other side co-opting the grandfather's ritual for its own ends? Were they reinforcing a binding, or unwittingly perfecting a gateway? Before he could voice these doubts, a sudden, loud crack echoed from outside the office, followed by the sound of shattering glass. They whirled towards the front window. A large, jagged hole had appeared in the glass pane as if something had punched through it from the outside. But there was nothing there. No rock, no bird, no person. Just the empty street. Then from Gable's own phone, lying on the desk, came that same hideous, rapid clicking, louder now, more insistent, accompanied by the high-pitched whine that drilled into their skulls. The lights in the office flickered violently. The papers on Gable's desk began to rustle and lift, as if stirred by an unseen wind. Gable screamed, a raw, terrified sound, backing away from his desk, his eyes fixed on the phone. "It found me. It knows I'm talking to you. It's here." The temperature in the small office plummeted. The clicking from the phone intensified, morphing into a chorus of guttural, whispering voices, speaking in a language that clawed at their sanity. A dark, oily patch began to spread on the wall behind Gable's desk, like a stain bleeding through from another dimension. Maddock grabbed the journal and the rolled-up plans. "Val, let's go, now." They turned to flee, but the office door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the lock audibly clicking into place. They were trapped. When Gable cowered in the corner, sobbing, as the dark stain on the wall grew, its edges seeming to writhe. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the guttural whispers from the phone rose to a deafening, mind-shattering crescendo. The counter-artisan, it seemed, did not appreciate its legacy being shared. The end.